Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We're so glad you could join us again.
Great to be here.
Today, we're taking a closer look at a really powerful little section from the Romans chapter 1, verses 15 to 17.
Right. It's where the Apostle Paul talks about his eagerness, his deep desire, really, to preach the gospel.
And we've got some insights today drawn from a couple of really interesting messages, one from DGM-TV, the other from Abogo.
Mm-hmm. And they pull out something, well, maybe a bit surprising about these verses, even if they feel familiar.
Exactly. So our mission, you could say, is to unpack that surprising angle on Paul's eagerness and then figure out, okay, what does this actually mean for us today? Ready to jump in?
Let's do it.
Okay, so let's unpack this first part, Romans 1.1 feet. Paul writes, "Therefore I am eager to bring my message even to you in Rome."
Right. And straight away, one of the messages highlights something that might make you pause for a second.
Yeah, because normally when we think preach the gospel, we think, well, sharing it with people who don't believe yet, right?
Exactly. People outside the church, people who haven't heard the good news before, that's usually the focus.
That's our standard idea of evangelism, taking it out there.
So you'd kind of expect Paul to say, I'm eager to preach to the pagans in Rome, or something like that.
Or those who haven't heard.
But here's the fascinating thing the sources really emphasize. Paul says he wants to preach the gospel to the church in Rome.
Wait, hold on. To the church.
Mm-hmm. To the community of believers already there, people who were, already saved Christians.
Wow, okay. That is genuinely surprising. So his eagerness wasn't for reaching the lost in Rome, primarily. It was for the Christians.
That's the key point the messages bring out. It wasn't about converting pagans in this specific statement. It was about bringing the gospel message to those who already believed.
So what does that tell us then?
Well, it strongly suggests, as the sermons point out, that the gospel isn't just a message for getting saved initially.
Right.
It's something believers need to keep hearing too. It's vital for those already in the faith.
Okay, that definitely sparks a question then.
Yeah.
Why? I mean, why would Christians, people who know the basics, who believe, who have the Spirit,
Yeah.
why do they need the gospel preached to them again?
That's the core question, isn't it? And the reason given in these messages is, well, it's quite profound, actually. It's because believers can lose something over time.
Lose what?
What one sermon vividly calls the thrill of salvation, that initial powerful impact.
The thrill of salvation. Okay, tell me more. How do they describe that?
Oh, it's described really powerfully. It's that feeling when you're first saved, when God's grace just hits you, your heart is overflowing, just full of grace and joy.
Right.
Maybe you even feel like singing out loud, just walking down the street, as one message put it. There's this sense of wonder.
Everything feels new.
Exactly. You see God's hand everywhere in a flower, a stone, just this awareness of his creation, his care, and deep gratitude for being saved, for being called a child of God. It's overwhelming.
That initial burst of life and connection.
Yes. And with that comes this natural energy. You're excited about prayer, praising God. You love reading the Bible. You want to connect with other believers. And you definitely want to share this amazing news with others. That's the thrill.
But the messages suggest this doesn't always stay at that high intensity.
That's the tough reality they acknowledge. After years in faith, 5, 10, 20 years, that initial vibrancy, that feeling can start to fade. It cools down.
It becomes normal, routine.
Sort of. The thrill can lessen, maybe even disappear. And one sermon warns it can leave just the sort of shell of the experience behind.
I think many people can probably relate to that feeling, sadly. Life gets in the way.
It does. And the messages make a crucial distinction here. You can still know the gospel inside and out.
Right, you can explain the theology.
Yeah, you can talk about the cross, the resurrection, justification, being God's child, all of it. You might even teach it. But that warmth in your heart, that joy, that awe, it might not be there anymore.
So your head gets it, but your heart isn't, like, pounding with it anymore.
Precisely. The connection feels more intellectual than experiential.
So Paul's goal in wanting to preach to them wasn't about their salvation status. They were already saved.
Correct. It was about reigniting something, restoring that thrill, refreshing what the sermons called the impressions of faith life, bringing back the joy of believing that might have gotten buried under routine or hardship.
It's about keeping the gospel's impact alive and dynamic, not just a past event.
Exactly. Not just getting saved, but living saved, living in the power and reality of that salvation daily.
That really brings it home, doesn't it? Makes you think. When you hear those descriptions, being deeply moved by the cross, excited by the resurrection, feeling that wonder of being God's child, maybe pause and ask yourself, do you still feel that power stirring? Or has faith become more of a head thing?
It's a really vital check-in prompted by these messages. Where is the vitality in our own faith walk?
Okay, so let's follow Paul's thought into the next verse, Romans 1:16. He says, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God to give salvation to all who believe."
Yes, and this verse is central. The sermons define the gospel right here. It is the power of God.
Not just about power, it is power.
Exactly, the divine force that actually saves people. And implied here is that it's a continuing power, one that can renew us, sustain us.
And the sources mentioned other verses that back this up.
They did, like 1 Corinthians 1:18, the message of the cross is foolishness to those perishing, but to us being saved, it is the power of God.
All right.
And later in 1 Corinthians, Paul basically says, the world looks for signs and wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, which seems weak or foolish, but it's actually God's power and heaven's wisdom.
The gospel isn't just a nice story or good advice.
No, it's presented as God's active power at work, real dynamic force.
And Paul specifies this power is to give salvation to all who believe.
The messages really underscore this. This saving power isn't automatic for everyone. It's accessed, it's received by those who hear the gospel and respond in faith.
So belief is the key that unlocks that power in a person's life.
Yes, if someone hears and rejects it, they don't step into that saving power. Acceptance through faith is crucial.
Now, one of the messages also briefly mentioned the idea of God's choice in this.
It did touch on that, yeah. That the reason some believe when the gospel is preached relates to God's election, but it wasn't the main focus.
Okay.
The sermon quickly pivoted back to the practical side. Since we don't know who is chosen, our job is to keep preaching to everyone, because faith, belief, is the human response needed to connect with God's saving power. The gospel is the power, faith is the conduit.
So, practically speaking, for us as believers, the takeaway from the source material is we need to keep living by faith in this gospel.
Absolutely. Continuously placing our trust, our reliance, specifically on what Jesus did, his death, his resurrection. That's the core. The messages emphasize that this active faith, holding on to the gospel alone, is how we stay connected to that power.
Which leads perfectly into the last verse we're looking at, Romans 1:17, and the sermon's conclusion. The righteous will live by faith.
Exactly. And tying it all together, the point driven home is, we who are righteous through Christ, we live our whole lives by faith in the gospel.
So it's not just the entry point.
Not at all. The source material insists it's the very air we breathe spiritually, the foundation we stand on every single day. It's how we live.
Not just believing once to get saved, but actively living by that gospel truth constantly. How did the sermon say that plays out?
Well, they connect it back to that fading thrill. They argue that keeping a strong, active faith in the gospel is precisely what keeps our spiritual life vibrant. It's what fuels the joy, the grace, the power. This constant reliance on Jesus' finished work, that's what renews us inside. It gives us the strength, the perspective to overcome challenges. It's where our confidence comes from, how God's power keeps working in us. It stops faith becoming just, a mental exercise or a habit.
It's about grounding ourselves daily in the reality of what Christ did and letting that truth shape everything.
That's a great way to put it. Letting the power of Romans 1:16 fuel the life of faith in Romans 1:17. The hope expressed in the messages is really for the listener, that our hearts would keep that sense of excitement about salvation, that we'd stay filled with God's grace, be confident because of the gospel, and experience its power to navigate life, ultimately living victoriously by faith in this message.
Wow. That's quite a deep dive from just 3 verses. That initial surprising point, Paul wanting to preach to believers, really does open up a fresh perspective.
It really does. It challenges the idea that the gospel is something you graduate from. No, it's the ongoing power source. We need it every day.
We need to keep coming back to it.
It's the foundation.
So as we wrap things up, thinking about Paul's desire to preach to Christians in Rome and the sermons highlighting the gospel as the power we live by, maybe the question to sit with is this: what does living by faith in the gospel look like, practically, in your life today?
Yeah, how can you intentionally bring the reality of Christ's death and resurrection into your daily challenges, your routines, even your relationships?
How could focusing on that maybe renew your perspective? Maybe even reignite some of that initial joy and wonder? Something to chew on?
Definitely.
Well, thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive. We really hope it gave you some valuable insights.
It's always good to explore these passages together.
We'll be back soon with another deep dive into another fascinating topic. Until then, keep exploring.